I wonder if your mother ever said to you, "How many times do I have to tell you?" Well, that led me to wondering, how many times does it take for the Lord to tell people so that they learn what the Lord will do, what he's going to do? And to say the same thing in other ways, how many times will it take you to learn to do what you really should do? I have to be honest and think, for me, it's probably several times, many times in fact. But what we're considering today is, how many times does it in fact take us to learn a spiritual truth? You would think that when something has been proved to be true spiritually to us, that we would learn that pretty quickly and apply it in our lives. And you would think that if God himself promised to do something, and then we saw it done and again, that we would take it on board, right? That we would begin to be able to take God at his word. But the reality is, God's children rarely learn that just because our Heavenly Father has done something, that we ought to be able to take that on board and apply it in our lives, and immediately accept his promises to be true. And I think there's no better illustration of that than what we see happening here to the children of Israel as they have just escaped out of Egypt. Now, the story we've been through recently is really, well, simply, it's incredible. And I'm sure many people know that story, even people who haven't grown up in the Christian faith. But you'll certainly have been reminded for it, the Exodus story, if you've just been following me through so far as we've worked together through this book called Exodus. A few chapters back in chapter 14, the children of Israel, they'd reached a point where they had been met head-on by Pharaoh's army, and they were at the point of potentially being annihilated, but they'd seen God intervene supernaturally, miraculously, and protect them, and in fact deliver them. I've also commented that outside of the resurrection, this is probably the most dramatic miracle in all of the Bible. Surely you'd think if God does something like that, then the people would get the message, right? But what we actually see is within a day of those events, they travel on, they've crossed the Red Sea, the water's divided before them, they travel for a day or so and they reach a place called Marah, and when they get there they find the water's not to their taste. It's bitter, and so they go and grumble. And again, they see God supernaturally intervene again and supply them with fresh water. So lesson 1, he protected them from the armies of Egypt. Lesson 2, he delivered them, bringing them out of Egypt in the most miraculous way. And in lesson 3, he provides for them, first with water, and then we saw in yesterday's study how he supplied their needs for food as well. And he does all these things in the most dramatic of fashions, in a supernatural way, so that they should never forget, something that they should never forget for the rest of their lives. Okay, let's see if they've finally learned the lesson today, right? Well, let's see. We're going to turn to Exodus chapter 17, and we're going to witness the very next episode in the life of the children of Israel. Now, this chapter is quite short by sort of Exodus standards, and it can be divided into two straightforward parts. In the first part of the passage, it's seen they need water again, and in the second part of the passage, they get attacked by an enemy army. So the very lessons that they should have directly learned from in these previous incidents are being replayed again now. So surely they're going to be prepared this time. Well, let's see and pick up the story in verse 1. Then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin, according to the commandment of the Lord. And they camped in Rephidim, but there was no water there for the people to drink. Therefore the people contended with Moses and said, "Give us water that we may drink." So Moses said to them, "Why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord?" And the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why have you brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" Now, there's lots more to come in this story, but we'll pause there long enough just to make a few observations about that auspicious opening. So in the first verse it tells us they leave this place called the wilderness of Sin. That name Sin, by the way, has no theological significance. It's just an ancient term for that area that phonetically to us sounds like the word sin. Anyway, they leave the wilderness of Sin and they get to the next stop on their journey and they camp at the place called Rephidim. Now, I know reading it out of the Exodus text, it pretty much sounds like they went straight from the wilderness of Sin to this place Rephidim. But if you read the rest of the Pentateuch, you'll discover in the book of Numbers that there were actually a couple of stops in between along the way. Now, the Bible does that quite a lot, particularly the Old Testament. It gives us a story, and then you will later find in another place that there are some gaps that are filled in for this. And the reason this happens is because, well, in this case, the author in Numbers is trying to make a point. So he fills in some narrative gaps to enable him to illustrate his point. But in Exodus, this is just the basic narrative story that Moses has decided to record for this. So in this case, he skips a few stops along the way, and it's when they get to the next stop, Rephidim, that's where there's going to be a problem. And the problem that they get when they arrive there is there doesn't appear to be any water. Now, do you remember they had a similar problem, well, not identical, but very similar, just in the last chapter or so, in that they arrived at this place called Marah, and the water there was undrinkable. It was bitter, spoiled. So you would think that they'd just seen the Lord supply water there. Surely what they would do is just simply go ask for him to do that again. How many times does God have to do something for them before they figure out that he will keep their promises and all they need to do is turn to him? But clearly they haven't got it. As a matter of fact, the text says that they wanted Moses to give them a drink of water, and that it was him they went to, and him they contended with, him they argued with. The word translated content actually means to argue, grumble, or complain. So they were upset about this, and instead of turning to the Lord, they end up quarrelling with Moses again, all of which points to the fact they have not learned their lesson and they're not trusting in the Lord. And that's the problem. And that was my opening question today. How many times is it going to take them, and by nature, how many times might it take us to finally learn to trust the Lord? What's it going to take? So anyway, in this case, we see they start out by having an argument with Moses. And Moses said to them, "Why are you quarrelling with me? The Lord is the one who brought you out of Egypt." And I might add, he said he brought you out with a promise, and his promise was that he was going to take care of you and take you into the promised land, right? So think about this for the minute. If the Lord said, "I'm going to take you out of Egypt and take you into the promised land," then is it likely that he's going to choose to let you die of thirst in the first few days in the wilderness? So the real issue here, let's be clear, the real issue here is the fact that they're not trusting the Lord. This whole thing began with the promise, "I'm taking you out of Egypt, and I'm taking you all the way," which means he's going to provide for them and protect for them, and that is surely built into the fabric of the promise God made to them at the beginning by taking them out of Egypt into the promised land. But for them, this situation, well, it's even worse than it appears on the surface, because not only is that promise given, but God has previously demonstrated his willingness to fulfill that promise by the supplying of water, by the supplying of food. So they've been given specific illustrations of how God can do those things, so they should have known that all would be okay, because God has done this very thing before. And yet they still find themselves saying, well, they go to Moses and they say, "Look, you, Moses, you're the one brought us out of Egypt, and you've done it. What have you done it for? Just to kill us and our children?" And they even mention their livestock. In their mind, they've just jumped immediately again to the conclusion that they're going to be wiped out. All the children, all the animals. And in fact, they're jumping to the most extreme emotional conclusions. Let's see what Moses said in reply. So Moses, well, he doesn't reply to them, because it tells us Moses cries out to the Lord, saying, "What shall I do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." So it appears this verse hints at the fact that they're not only blaming him and complaining, but they're getting to the point where they're sort of almost willing to rise up and kill him. This is unbelievable, isn't it? And what does Moses do in his response? Well, now he's doing what he should have done right from the beginning, but it's now becoming a pattern, an illustration of character. He's doing what he will now seem to do over and over again. When he has a problem, he prays. He takes the situation straight to the Lord, and he says, we can almost hear the sigh, "Oh Lord, what shall I do with these people?" How many times do these people have to go through problems before they get the message that the Lord has made some provision for them, and he promises to do what he promises to do, and that they need to trust in that? Well, in this situation, Moses got it, but it seems that 2 million other people didn't get it, at this point at any rate. The text continues. And the Lord said to Moses, Go before the people, and take with you some of the elders of Israel. Also take in your hand your rod, which with you struck the river. And behold, I will stand there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, and the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So the Lord's response to Moses' prayer is, here's the plan. I want you to take the rod, that staff, the one that you held. Remember, he held it over the Nile River, so they saw that. The one that you held up when you came to the Red Sea, that you saw that. The one that we used to change the water in Rephidim from bitter to sweet. I want you to go and strike the rock with that rod, that staff, and I will provide the water. And it tells us that Moses did in fact do that, and he strikes the rock, and the water comes out, and witnessed by the people and by the leaders, and that water satisfied the thirst of the people. Now, as a quick aside, many point out that this is obviously a use of typology here, in that for Christians, Jesus is described as the rock, and also he gives the water of life that will satisfy our spiritual thirst. That's taught and referred to frequently in the New Testament. And that's what many people will look at this and see this as a prototype of that event prefigured in the Old Testament, and I don't object to that. Jesus in the New Testament is indeed described at the rock, so clearly there's a New Testament warrant for saying that what Moses did in taking this rod and striking the rock and supplying the water to satisfy the people's spiritual needs is a picture that is foreshadowing what Jesus will do when he comes and what he represents. Anyway, back with the Exodus text, it continues in verse 7. So he called the name of the place, that's where these events have taken place, Massah and Meribah, because of the contention of the children of Israel, and because they tempted the Lord, saying, Is the Lord among us or not? And those two names that Moses gives them, they mean exactly what it says happened there. They mean, it says, because they tempted and they contended with the Lord. So effectively, the names of those places translate as temptation and contention, Massah and Meribah. And the people, they tempted the Lord by actually questioning whether he was even with them at all, even though he demonstrated, even recently, that he was indeed with them. By the way, this whole idea of contending and complaining is only mentioned a few times in the Bible. It happens in 2 other passages in the Pentateuch. It's mentioned in Exodus twice and in Numbers chapter 14. And if you really want to find out what God thinks about people's complaining, then if you've got time, I don't have time for it today, I suggest you go read Numbers 14. As an aside, I did some study in the book of Numbers a few years back for a sermon, and I emerged from that process thinking, I always thought the big issues with God were murder, adultery, and stealing and the like. But if you read the book of Numbers, you can't help but walk away there with the impression that maybe one of the main things, certainly one of the top 10 things I would say that God detests is complaining amongst his people. So how many times does God have to say, or does God have to do something before he will stop his people complaining and embrace the message? But to just reflect that on ourselves for a moment, if we were to ask the question, how many times have you seen God work on your life? Well, I'm sure you can recall many, and you can count on many. But if I was to ask you at the same time, how long is it since you complained about something? I would imagine that the complaining was much more frequent than what we could testify, and able to call to mind much more readily than those things about what God has done in your life. Another question, how many times have you read the Bible? Which is just another way of saying, how many times have you read about God saying, I will provide for you and protect you? And then think about when was the last time you complained or grumbled about something. There's something to take on board there, isn't there, friends? Anyway, that's kind of what's going on in this passage. In the context of the book, what we're seeing is the people complaining over and over again, and the Lord is reaching the point where he's saying, look, you're becoming hard-hearted. What do I have to do? And then graciously we see him provide for them again and again, and he does that because he promised he would. All right, I said the message of this chapter was divided into 2 parts. This first part is about God providing water and spiritual sustenance, and the second part is about God providing protection. They were satisfied with the water, and now the text continues in verse 8, where it says, "Now Amalek came and fought with Israel in Rephidim." So that's a quick turn of events in it. Now they have this immediate problem confronting them. They're going to have to contend, battle with the first enemy that they have met since the Egyptians. Now, I've quoted him a few times. There's a famous Roman historian called Josephus, who lived in the 1st century, and he wrote a very famous piece of work that still survives to this day. And he said, commenting on this, that the people who attacked the children of Israel were the most warlike of any of the nations at that time. In fact, these were the people for whom the original name warmongers was first used. So let's hear about them and about what happens. Verse 9. "And Moses said to Joshua, Choose up some men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. And so Joshua did as Moses said to him, and fought with Amalek. And Moses and Aaron and Hur went up to the top of the hill. And so it was, when Moses held up his hand, that Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hands, Amalek prevailed." By the way, I can't help but point out to the fact that suddenly this new character appeared. Where did he come from? Joshua. Now, scholars will tell you that Joshua was about 45 years old at this point. So Moses now, remember, is quite an old man. And in fact, when Moses dies, Joshua is the one who takes over. In Joshua chapter 1, the Lord will come to Joshua and say, "Moses, my servant, is now dead, and now you are to lead the people into the promised land." But it is here, in this verse, where we're introduced to the character of Joshua for the first time, and he is the one who's told to take some men and go out and lead the fight, while Moses stand nearby on the top of a hill with this rod, this staff of God in his hand. And then we have this other new character introduced, who is Hur. Now, not much is known about him, but you can pick up from the text, if you look closely, is that he is in fact married to Moses' sister Miriam. Anyway, Moses takes her with him, and they together go up to the top of the hill along with Aaron. And it says that Moses held up his hands, and while he did that, Israel prevailed, and when he let down his hands, the enemy had the upper hand. So what's going on here? The answer is that Moses goes on the top of the hill, and he has in his hand that rod, that staff, the very thing he used to part the Red Sea, the very thing he used to strike the rock to draw water, and he holds it up in his hands, raises his hands up to the heavens, holding the rod and the staff. But the battle goes on all day. I wonder if you think you could hold your hands over your head, and how long you could do it for, especially if you had a large rod or staff carved out of a branch tree in your hands. Let me tell you, I've watched the World's Strongest Man competition, and some of those events they compete in illustrate that even holding something that for them would not be that heavy soon becomes very heavy when they have to hold it for a long time. So we then see Aaron and Hur help hold up Moses' arms for him and with him. So what's that all about? What's going on here? It actually says when they held up his hands, it says they prevailed. They were winning the battle, and when he let down their hands, they began to lose. So what's going on here? Now, as far as I can make out, this is just as straightforward as it might seem. It would seem that this is simply a reference to prayer. After all, what they're doing is holding up their hands. That's what it usually means, doesn't it? Everybody who studied this passage for centuries, for millennia, in fact, have come to the same conclusion. I wondered if there was something more to it, but I have to, without getting too wrapped up in stretching typology to breaking point, I agree with the conclusion that almost every mainstream person who looked at this passage has come to the conclusion that it simply represents prayer. That's what the very ancient rabbis said about this. In fact, the Targums, which are the earliest Jewish writing, that's what they said. And all the early church fathers, those who were in the first couple of centuries after Christ and after the apostles, they said similar. And all the modern commentators right up to the 19th century all said the same thing, right up to this day, that this is referencing the importance of prayer and how important it is to uphold and support one another in prayer, and how especially important that becomes when one of a group might be struggling or becoming weary. And we see here, as long as they were praying, they were victorious. But when Moses lets down his hands, when he, so to speak, stopped praying, then we see events turn against them. One commentator I read commenting on this said, "I am convinced that above all, this proves to me that which I always knew, that all advances for Christ actually become about because of believers who understand and practice prayer." I think the modern church depends a little too much on programs these days, when what the scripture teaches right from the beginning is that we ought to be depending on prayer. Now, don't get me wrong, programs work. Programs can help build churches, but what really builds Christians and Christian communities is individual and, importantly, corporate prayer. Verse 12, "But Moses' hands became heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. And Aaron and Hur supported his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side, and his hands were steady until the going down of the sun." So he's in that prayerful position all day. Incredible. But notice, as the day progresses, this becomes less of an individual prayer and more of a group supportive prayer. And I have to say that as I've worked my way through the New Testament over the years, I've always been impressed with the fact that there is a huge emphasis on group prayer in the New Testament. There are, of course, individual prayers, but by and large, the New Testament, we see a definite swing towards people coming together to pray in community. Now, I know throughout my life people have prayed for me in my ministry, and I sometimes wonder how much of whatever I have accomplished, for whatever it's worth, in my life and ministry, was any of it really attributable to me, or is more likely I feel it was a benefit of those people, of God moving because of the prayers of other people. I'm tempted at this point to say, if you're listening to this today, then to pray for me and for this ministry, that the Lord would continue to use it and to grow it. But what we need to note today out of this text is the basic fact that we all need to pray. And we need to pray on our own, but we also need to pray with other Christian believers. And even the great leader Moses, well, he prayed, but he had to have people praying with him and alongside him. Many years ago, a wise old preacher said, we think great preachers make great churches, but maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's a great community of believers that then can make and ultimately call great preachers. Okay, we're almost done with the main text. Let's close off this chapter, and it tells us this. So Joshua defeated Amalek and the people with the edge of the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this for a memorial in a book, and recount it in the hearing of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar there, and called its name, "The Lord is my banner." For he said, "Because the Lord has sworn, the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." Now, Josephus, in his history of the Jewish people, says that this huge enemy was defeated in this battle, and he even makes the claim that not a single Israelite died in the battle. Now, the text doesn't say that, but I find it interesting that Joseph the historian did say that. Anyway, but what we've got here is God telling Moses, "I want you to write these events down in the book." Now, this is the first time God says this. And as we progress through the Pentateuch, these 5 first books of the Bible, inspired and scribed by Moses or by Joshua himself, commenting on the events that happened with Moses, we see God for the first time saying, "I want you to write this down. And I want you to write it down. The enemies of God are going to be totally wiped out. And I want Joshua to know that that's that. In fact, get him to scribe it so that he will know that too." And when we see and get to the book of Joshua, where sure enough, he's the one who's going to fight with all these people as they take the land of Canaan. But it's reminding him and us that Israel will not face a total loss in their battles. In fact, they don't in reality face a total loss. It's not until the time of David that things really go badly wrong for them. So in the meantime, Moses is told to build an altar and a memorial, and he is told to stick a flag up and build a memorial and call that flag, "The Lord is my banner." In other words, you've won the victory, now you're to fly the flag and a remembrance to other people. And that's what this amounts to. He's going to build an altar and establish a memorial to the Lord. But he wants them also to do that by writing it all down in a book. And notice that he says he wants to do that so that this can go from generation to generation. Do you see that, what God's saying? He's simply saying the people are likely to forget. So the people are always going to need to be reminded of these miraculous things that God did in those days. And would you believe it, right down to this day, that words on a page, the Bible, has outlasted and outlanded any of the world's greatest buildings and structures. So guess what? You're reading that book that God told Moses to scribe today. And you and I here are now, today, being reminded of what God did that day. And we need to get reminded. We need to be reminded. We need to be reminded by this book, reminded that God made promises, promises to protect you, promises to provide for you, and God wants those promises to be remembered and never forgotten from generation to generation. So this whole chapter, this whole book of Exodus, this whole Bible is telling us, constantly reminding us that God will keep his promises, the promises to protect us and to provide for us. And I started out by asking today, how many times does God have to remind us of something before we get it? Well, apparently it appears he has to do it over and over again. Finally, he gets to the point, he says, look, in order for you guys to remember this, I'm going to put it in a book. And thereby every generation can read it, because you know what? If they don't have it, they're going to forget. Now let me put all this in a slightly different way as we close. I want to read for you from Romans chapter 8, and we're going to begin at verse 31, because this is how this is all summed up within the New Testament, New Covenant perspective. What shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? God, who did not spare his own Son, but delivered him up for us, how shall he not with him also freely give us all things? Who shall bring a charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. It is he who condemns. It is Christ who died, and furthermore is also risen, who is even now at the right hand of God and making intercession for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, nakedness, or peril, or even the sword? As it is written, for your sake we were killed all day long. We were accounted as sheep for the slaughter. Yet in all these things we are made more than conquerors through him who has loved us. Here's the conclusion. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor powers, nor any things present, nor things to come, nor heights, nor depth, nor any other created thing shall be able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Did you see that? He spared not his own Son freely to give us all the things he has promised to give us. And by turning to his word and praying, we are to remind ourselves and to remember that truth always.